Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to a new episode of What's New in Opening Theory. And yeah, there have been some developments during the World Championship match and also after the World Championship match, which I haven't touched on yet. And therefore, this video is for you, just to let you know what type of updates there were. There were a couple of them, a couple of new interesting ideas in the opening. So let's jump right into them. Now, the first idea which I want to have a look at is was played by Arjun Erigaisi in the Qatar Masters, which happened next to the World Championship match. And it is a certain system against the London, which Erigaisi played. So Erigaisi had black pieces. It was in round one of the Qatar Masters. His opponent was an opponent from, I think he's from Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. I will try to pronounce the name. Abdurakhmonov Muhammad Ali. I hope that was at least somewhat accurate. Anyway, the game started with d4. Arjun went knight f6, bishop f4, e6, knight f3. So what I have to say is that if you have the black pieces, of course, there are many different move orders. For example, if you play the King's Indian or the Grunfeld, you might play with g6, where there are also many interesting ideas for black. But in this video, or in this segment of the video, I want to have a look at what happens if you want to play with e6, which also works if white goes knight f3 first, then to go e6. So now you're very flexible. After c4, you could go for the Queen's Indian or the Bogo Indian, or transpose back to the main lines with d5, for example. But after bishop f4, Arjun also played e6 here, and here after knight f3, this is kind of the position you can get through a couple of move orders with the black pieces. And here after c5, e3, knight c6, now knight bd2, this is kind of the starting position. And here Arjun played this funny looking move h6, and this is kind of the start of the idea. I think this is quite interesting. I did have a look at it, and honestly I had a hard time even finding any idea for white here to try and play for something. The idea is that often black prepares knight h5 without allowing bishop g5. So you want to get knight h5 and then just collecting the bishop pair on f4, basically. It kind of reminds me of the idea I played in the German Bundesliga, which was after here knight f3, e6, bishop f4, I played bishop e7. Also somewhat with a similar idea. My opponent played e3, or I think he played knight d2. I'm not even sure. I think he played knight e2 and now knight h5. This was the game when I also managed to get the bishop pair in that game. So once black manages to do this, in most of the cases he is fine. But what can white do after h6? I had a look at two moves here. The first one being c3, which I think is the most logical. But now, as discussed, knight h5 is just coming, and it's actually pretty hard for white to come up with something. The usual move, bishop g3, white wants to make in the London, is not as effective here. Usually white plays it after black goes something like d5 and bishop d6. Here bishop g3 is one of the moves. But when black manages to capture with the knight on g3, as here, now black keeps the dark squared bishop, which is very powerful in this position. I continue checking this a bit after bishop d3, bishop d7 looks logical, then queen b6, forcing rook b1 basically. And now bishop e7. The only plan white can play for here is to break in the center with e4. So he would have to take, and after e4, there were a couple of moves for black. I liked a5 just to get b4 out of the position. Also after knight b3 now, whenever white goes there, black can just retreat to d6, for example, and then a4 could come and hit the knight on b3. So I felt like this position is pretty nice for black. White could also take on c5, but again, it reaches somewhat similar of the game I had against Valentin Buchholz in the German Bundesliga. This was also, in fact, Arjun Erigaisi's game. He took on c5, which is totally okay for black. I also want to mention the move queen c7, kind of intermediate move, and after g3 only then to take on c5 to even keep the bishop pair. Now after knight e4, bishop e7, white doesn't have knight d6. Because what happened in the game here after knight e4, his opponent managed to get this bishop, but still black is totally fine. Arjun played queen e7, his opponent captured, and Arjun won a very nice endgame here. I would already take black because he has the better pawn structure and he can play on the queen side later on with some b5, b4, for example. White should have gone queen d2, but also here the position is equal, something like bishop b7, short castle. Black is not in any real danger here. But yeah, queen c7 might be another idea just to provoke g3, and now not even knight d6 is working. But c3 not the most, not the best move probably, but it's hard to say what else white can do. H3 is the other possibility which I checked. But yeah, here now the point is you want to go d5, and now the issue for white is after the move c3, now black can go bishop d6, and now we have kind of the main line just with the inclusion of h6 and h3. But h3 is actually sort of a weakness for white, because now white cannot go bishop g3 what he wants to do in the main line, because now black can take, and white has to take with the f pawn, which of course he doesn't want to do. Now queen d6 could come, the pawn on g3 is weak, and so is white's king on e1. So after bishop d6, white can take on d6 just, but yeah, now black is already intending to push e5. For example, if white does something logical looking like bishop d3, short castle e5, black can take the initiative very soon. Some positions like this are already a bit more pleasant for black because he has the central pawn advantage. Bishop e5 is another idea here, but after short castle, black can go bishop d7, or there's a threat of knight takes d4. For example, rook e1, knight takes d4 could be an idea, because when white takes on d7, there's this intermediate check on f3. Black will take on d7 on the next move and simply picked up a pawn in the whole process. So yeah, knight e5 is the last idea I could come up with here, but now simply queen c7, challenging the knight on e5, and after knight f3, short castle. The only important thing is here to challenge the knight on e5 by going knight d7 next, and yeah, there is just nothing to be scared of here. For example, white could take either of the knights, and then black will again try to push e5, the same after knight c6, b takes c6, and again e5 is coming and black is not in any danger at all. I want to go back to this position. We had the move knight bd2, which is mostly played, but white could also start with c3. Now, and again, h6 seems like an interesting idea, because after knight bd2 we are back in our line, and the same after h3 d5. I don't see anything better than knight bd2, which would transpose back to our variation. I also want to point out Alexei played knight h5 here against me in the Warsaw 2021 Rapid World Championship, which is also quite an interesting system. The game continued bishop g5, that's what I played. He played queen b6, and now I played queen b3, which is mostly played, but here black again gets already a slightly more pleasant position, just he has the bishop pair, and Dreyev won a very nice game against me. So knight h5 is another option here, but overall I really like this idea with h6. I mean, if you play the knight f6 e6 against the queen's gambit, then this could definitely be added to your repertoire. Now the next idea I want to present to you is not that new, I would say. It's already been played a couple of months ago even, but I still see it played on a very high level pretty often. And this game, which I saw, was played by Narayanan SL against Prraneeth, again in the Qatar Masters. Both Grandmasters, Narayanan, almost 2700 player. And this variation is actually for white. Let me just flip the board. And it is in the Moscow variation, this anti-Sicilian, which is a nice practical choice, because after d4, you need to prepare it against the Najdorf, you need to be prepared against the dragon and against the classical Sicilian. So there are many things which are all very sharp and good openings for black. And with bishop e5 check, mostly you will get more of a solid game. Now the line I want to present is after knight d7, of course bishop d7 being the other main move. And here after short castle, a6, the move bishop e2, which is still pretty rare. Bishop d3 is the main move. Then with white's idea being c3 followed by bishop c2 and then d4 just to grab the center. But yeah, bishop e2 is kind of the new idea. And that after knight f6, now to develop with d3. So this looks pretty passive, but white has two ideas. The first one is, white is just waiting to see how black will develop. Black could develop by going g6 and then bishop g7. After g6, white would have the idea to get some sort of Marozzi position. Now after d4 will come, and then the knight on d7 will actually be pretty misplaced here. And that's kind of also a theme we see pretty often in this line, that the knight on d7 is just often misplaced, and black will even take time often to regroup it with knight b8 followed by knight c6, because it just doesn't do much at all on d7, and on top of that it blocks the bishop on c8 from developing. So this is the idea after g6, but after e6, which is mostly played, Now black would like to gain some space on the queen side with b5, so therefore white goes a4, and after b6, now kind of the start of the whole idea, this move knight fd2. Which again looks pretty strange for white to play like this, because the knight on b1 is still not developed. Also, you're blocking the bishop on c1 from developing. But the main idea is just for white to push f4. And it turns out, practically speaking, it's actually quite hard to handle for black if you don't know this. Because most of the games go like this. Black just goes bishop b7, which is very logical. And after f4, black goes either bishop e7 or queen c7. It mostly leads to the same. Some position like this would come. This also happened in the game I took as an example, Narayanan against Prraneeth. And yeah, here knight c3, short castle, and now the whole idea for white is to advance on the king side with g4 followed by g5. And these positions can become pretty bad for black actually quite soon. In their game, rook a8 followed the g5, knight e8, and now white played bishop g2, which is an okay move, but even better is to go knight c4 here, when the idea is later on to go queen e2 followed by queen g2, and then already f5 could be coming, and white already has quite a big advantage here. So yeah, this is what most black players will do here, just running into trouble very soon. There is kind of the solution which I've already had for quite a long time for black here, which is knight e5. So in case you're playing this with the black pieces, I would recommend you look into this. Again, it looks a bit strange also to now move this knight again, but the idea is just the knight will come back to c6, where it's doing a lot more than on d7. As I said before, the knight on d7 is kind of black's problem in these positions usually. And here, yeah, bishop f3. Now white could threaten some e5, so black goes bishop b7. And here there was only one game, Mazier against Moussa, when Mazier played e5. But after the takes, now Moussa played knight d5, which is also okay, but knight d7 even better. And after knight c4, b5, we get this position when actually only black can be better, because the pawn on d6 is just pretty weak in the long run, and white doesn't have enough active play for that. What's better for white than to go e5 is most likely to go c3 and then to go for some position like this. But this kind of doesn't feel that right, so therefore I didn't also really like the variation for white because of this, but almost no black players will go knight e5 here, so that's kind of a gamble you can make. And also this position is very playable. It's not typical for Sicilian players to go into structures like this, because most likely black will have to go d5 at some point, and now we will have kind of a French structure, king h1 for example, and the position is still very playable. Black will have a hard time advancing his pawns on the queen side, at least for now, and white still does have some attacking possibilities on the king side sooner or later, and he could also play in the center as well with either c4 or with d4. So overall, still a pretty good and fresh idea. And yeah, if you do play the bishop b5 check Sicilian, I would definitely recommend you look further into this. Now the next idea I want to show you is kind of a mini repertoire against 1c4, because at least me personally, back in the day I used to play the Nimzo Indian against d4. I played the Nimzo and I played the Bogo Indian or the Queen's Indian against knight f3 here, and therefore I was always struggling against 1c4, because after e6, knight c3, after knight f6, now white can go d4, transpose back to the Nimzo. But what kind of was my issue was this line with e4, the Mykenas, and therefore I was always struggling against c4. What I did play already in the past, and what I now want to show you, is this move bishop b4, which is kind of like a hybrid Nimzo Indian. So white didn't play d4 yet, but also black didn't develop his knight to f6 yet. And there were two games which caught my attention, which were played recently in this variation, and I do think that it's actually fully playable. So let's go through the variations for white. One game which I looked at was the game Idani Puya with the black pieces against Shant Sargsyan, again from the Qatar Masters tournament. And here Sargsyan went queen b3, which is one of the moves. I will get into the other moves a bit later. And now bishop a5 is the move. Again, it does look a bit strange as well to move back the bishop, but also the queen on b3 is not placed that well. And for now, if black doesn't have to give up the bishop on c3, he doesn't really want to. Now white usually goes knight f3 and now knight f6. And here again, white does have a couple of moves. I looked at 3 of them. One idea which you should keep in mind always is this idea with g4, which was also played with the queen on c2, if I remember correctly. And here it's just important not to take, because after rook g1, the pawn g7 would fall sooner or later, and this could be pretty dangerous for black. But h6 looks pretty good, and now white has to, again, use 2 moves to get g5, rook g1 and h4, and a position like this, just knight g8, knight is coming to e7, and then black will try to push for d5, when I would actually already prefer black's position. So yeah, this is about g4, which will not happen that often. g3 is another option. Again, now black has a couple of options. c5 would be one of them. You could also castle short. There are some small move order differences. This was actually played by Shant Sargsyan in their game. Idani Puya went short castle. I did find one argument for starting with c5, but it's pretty deep, I would say. In general, black wants to get knight c6 followed by short castle. If that happens, he's totally fine. The only critical try for white is to go d4, and now after takes, knight c6. And the reason why c5 first might be a bit more accurate is that if black castles first, bishop g2, c5, now if d4, in the same variation here, white does have this option with bishop e3, which doesn't work that well if the bishop is still on f1. So therefore it speaks a bit for starting with c5. Anyway, d4 is quite unlikely, I would say, because white hasn't castled yet. It looks pretty dangerous. And here this knight c6 is totally fine. Bishop e3 also looks awkward now with the bishop still on f1. And here after knight g4, this is the variation I looked at, queen b6, and black is totally fine, especially if white has to take here. Black even has the better pawn structure. So knight c6 is more logical. Now, black could even take d takes c6, but bc6 looks more in the spirit, and after this, just d5 looks very healthy for black overall. Position is also objectively equal. Yeah, so again, c5 might be a bit more accurate. What Shant Sargsyan played was the setup with bishop g2 and just short castle, and here he went for rook d1. And Idani went e5, and again, black is very comfortable here. The game continued d3, h6, bishop d2, d6, and here I would conclude the analysis. Black has 2 ideas, or the biggest idea I would say is to go rook b8 followed by a6, b5, just to gain space on the queen side. h6, by the way, important move to stop bishop g5. If d6, bishop g5, white would like to take on f6 and then gain control of the d5 square. So yeah, this is about queen b3. Bishop a5 is the move to remember. And yeah, this just seems very playable for black, because the queen on b3 is just often a bit misplaced. Therefore, I think better for white is to go queen c2, when the most solid for black is to go knight f6. And here, whenever white goes a3, just to take and go for a position like this, which I think is totally playable. If white goes d4, black can go for b6, bishop b7, which is very much in the Bogo style. And if white doesn't go d4, black can go e5 himself and develop like this. Knight b d7, and yeah, maybe white is a little bit better because of the bishop pair, but from my experience, what I checked here is that it's not much at all. Black can follow up with moves like queen e7, maybe drop back the bishop to h5 or to g6. Probably not yet, because the pin on this diagonal is a bit unpleasant for white. But yeah, this seemed very okay. There was also one interesting idea, which is knight c6, hoping for white to go a3, because then after take, queen f6 is actually very interesting. This is what I already played in one online game. And if white goes to this endgame, it can actually go wrong pretty soon, because black has this idea of knight a5, knight b3, also attacking the pawn on c4. But after knight c6, better is to go e3. I think I even had a game against Radoslav Wojtaszek here in the World Blitz Championship. And then we have some sort of Nimzo position with the knight on c6, which is a sideline there as well, which is also playable. I've played this many times myself. But yeah, knight f6 is probably the more solid way to play, not putting the knight to c6. The last variation I want to have a look at is e4, and this brings me to the next point. This line was also played by Vincent Keimer against Denis Lazavik in the ongoing Oslo esports finals. And yeah, this is what Keimer played with the black pieces, and here he went for knight e7. which is one of the moves. Also, I quite like the move d6, which is also very rare here. Black just wants to prepare knight f6 here, because knight f6 immediately fails due to e5. And after d6, I also had a hard time finding anything special for white. d4 is probably the best objectively, but after c5, if white goes d5, now this already looks a bit awkward for white, with the queen on e7 looking at the king on e1. And black does have these ideas with f5 as well, when, at least practically speaking, there's already a lot of pressure on white here. So knight f3 is another option, but now after knight f6, d3, c5. Again, we have somewhat of a similar structure as with queen b3 earlier, and black will just follow with short castle. And again, there's this idea with a6, rook b8, followed by b5, and I think black is totally fine. What Vincent Keimer played is the move knight e7, which is also quite interesting. Here, Lazavik went for knight f3, short castle, and after d4, the key idea to keep in mind is to counter in the center with d5. Lazavik played the best move, bishop d3. What also does look logical is for white to go into this position, because this structure is often very good for white, because he has so much space. But here black is very fast with counterplay c5, and after a3 just bishop a5. And whenever white takes here, now it's time to take on c3, because now we can recapture the pawn on c5. If bishop e3, queen c7, we'll take on c5 next, and then the pawn on c3 will be a weakness as well. So bishop d3 was played by Denis Lazavik, and here Keimer went for d takes c4, probably being out of book already. c5 is much better, and after c5, the position can become a little bit dry. If takes, it could become symmetrical very soon, but not very dangerous for black. If short castle, black can just liquidate here, knight c6, looks totally okay. And c takes d5, probably the best, but not so easy practically for white to go here, because you have to see that after takes, white has this tactic with bishop h7 when he's regaining the bishop on c3 and black's king is a bit weak. Even this is playable for black, but I would prefer to go knight c6 here, when the position looks pretty balanced to me. So I'm not sure what I would do here. Maybe I would actually go d6, because it does ask white some questions as well, how he wants to develop. But knight e7 is also definitely one option, but this idea with d6 followed by knight f6 sparks some interest for me as well. So overall, I was pretty surprised, I would even say, that this line with bishop e4 is actually very, very playable. All right, so the next idea I want to show you is kind of a mini repertoire against the same-ish Nimzo Indian. So the Nimzo Indian with f3 on the fourth move, which is a very dangerous system and which is still often played pretty often, even on the highest level. This game, again, was from the Oslo Champions Chess Tour finals between Vachier-Lagrave and Denis Lazavik with the black pieces. And here, Denis Lazavik played a line which I really haven't seen before, I would say, even though there are still some games there. To me, it was a total surprise. So he went d5, of course, one of the moves, c5 and short castle being the other moves. But Lazavik went for d5, and after a3, which is the main move, bishop e7. Bishop takes e3, of course, being the other move. But he went bishop e7, and after e4, he went d takes c4, which is kind of where my knowledge ends here. At least it used to end. Now that I have had a look here, I do know a little bit more. The line which I was familiar with was d takes e4, and after f takes e4, c5 is kind of a modern line as well. e5 also used to be played, but after d5 it turns out white has good chances because of this very strong center. But c5 is also one idea for black, which to my knowledge is also okay, but I never really liked giving white the this central advantage here as well. But Lazavik went for d takes e4, and Vachier-Lagrave went bishop e3, which is actually kind of an inaccuracy already. White should take on c4. That's the better option. So let's have a look at it first. And here's c5. And it's actually not easy for white to even get anything out of this. I checked 3 moves here. Let's have a look at d5 first, just advancing the pawn. And after short castle, black will get this sort of structure, which at first looks slightly better for white because the bishop on d5 is so strong. But once you see this plan for black, which is knight a6 followed by knight c7, which challenges the bishop on d5, then you might realize that black is actually not in any danger here. This was also a correspondence game from 2021, which ended in a draw. And yeah, it looks very much okay for black. Also, rook d8 could be coming fairly soon. So d5 is one of the moves. D takes c5, of course, also logical. And after takes, bishop c5, position looks very okay for black. White is maybe a tad better here, like minimally better, because he does have more space in the center. But it could also backfire for him because he does have more weak squares in the center as a result of it. b4 is logical. This was played in a couple of games, bishop b6 and after knight e2. I think a6 was a novelty here. The point is that now after knight a4, the bishop can always retreat to a7, and overall a6 is just a logical move. And black still has two options, the first one being castle, but what is most likely even better is to just keep the king in the center since it's already an endgame and go king e7, followed by rook d8 and then knight c6, maybe knight d4. So this looks already pretty okay for black. Knight g2 is probably the best for white, and after short castle, bishop e3, here knight c6 is the move. And yeah, these moves you have to know, because after d takes c5, it just at first it looks like white is winning a pawn, but black does have enough counterplay with knight e5 to come. And after knight e5, if the bishop goes back on this diagonal, black has knight d3 check. And the king has to go to f1, and here b6 is very strong. This was one game between Sarana and Esipenko from 2021, and the game continued c6, bishop c5, and Esipenko actually won a very nice game here. The king on f1 is a target, and bishop a6 could come very soon, so here black already has the initiative. Better most likely is to go queen b3, but here another important idea, knight fd7, when knight takes c5 is already a big threat, and after rook d1, queen c7 renews the threat. So again, knight c5 or bishop c5 is there, and black is doing pretty good here. But bishop e3 was played by MVL, and this already gives good chances for black. Lazavik, I'm pretty sure, knew the way to go here. b5 is a very strong idea, because now with bishop e3 already being played, it will be harder to get c5, but b5 being a very concrete and nice solution for black. So if white wants to regain something, he has to take on b5 right away. Otherwise, black will just be one pawn up, and he can solidify with a6, for example. So white has to take, and now after bishop a6, white cannot take on c4 because of c6 when he would lose a piece. So knight c3, MVL went back, and after short castle, already black has the initiative. MVL went knight h3, but after c5, d takes c5, queen c7, already Lazavik was much better. Knight fd7 would have even been a little bit stronger. The same idea we saw before, to take here, and then knight d3 is looming. And but yeah, queen c7 was also pretty good. Knight h3, as I said, sort of a mistake. Queen a4 is better, but again, we have c5, and the same idea, important. Knight fd7 when black will recapture on c5 next and will not be in any danger at all, because still the king on e1 is pretty weak in the long run as well. So I was, again, just to summarize my thoughts here, I was very much surprised to see this variation. I never really checked it before, never even saw it. But it does turn out to be actually a very nice surprise weapon, I would even say, against the f3 Nimzo. The next idea I want to show you was another idea by Denis Lazavik. Somehow he's been throwing around great opening preparation in the Oslo finals. And here he had the white pieces against Jan Nepomniachtchi, and he went for knight f3, d5, b3, which of course black has many different options here. But the idea starts here if black develops like the most natural way or the most classical way with e6, bishop e7. Here, Denis Lazavik unleashed the move g4, which is a typical idea pretty often, but I've never seen it in this specific position before. And I did have a look here, and it leads to very, very unusual positions, which can become pretty dangerous for black if he doesn't react correctly, which is hard, of course, in such an early g4 expenditure on the king side. So Jan went for short castle, which is probably the best move. Black could also go for h6, but after rook g1, it probably only makes things worse because h4, g5 will come, and yeah, still the pawn on g7 will be weak. And now black can never, again, castle anymore, because then just the whole kingside will open up due to the hook existing on h6. So what else is there? Knight takes g4, of course, also an option, but after rook g1, if the knight goes back, rook g7 will come when, again, white's attack is pretty strong. Bishop f6 is one funny idea. The point is after bishop f6, if white takes, queen takes f6, now the rook on a1 is hanging as well. So white cannot take on g4. But it turns out that d4 is a nice idea, because now the bishop on f6 is somewhat in black's way, and the knight has to go back to this passive square in h6, and here knight c3. So totally new position, but it looks pretty dangerous for black because e4 will come. And yeah, for example, if short castle e4, if takes, in some cases white can take here, then d5 is coming, and all of a sudden the bishop on b2 will just be an absolute monster. So probably black shouldn't take. Short castle seems like a good idea, which Jan played, and after g5, Nepomniachtchi went for knight e4. Knight fd7 is also an option, but here after h4, just protecting the pawn on g5, and if c5, d4, white can also play in the center. And here there was just one important thing. Usually in this structure, white plays with c4, but since white already started playing on the king side, he doesn't really want to open the whole center. So knight c3 was the way to go here. And whenever black takes on d4, even here, if he takes twice, is a huge mistake, because white can take with the queen, and then the pawn on g7. There are all sorts of discoveries here with knight takes d5. Black is already in a lot of trouble here. So a6 would be a better option, and now, for example, bishop g2, b5, and again, white wants to open this diagonal with d takes c5, and later on continue pushing with h5 on the king side. Again, objectively, this position is probably around equal, but white does have pretty good attacking chances on the king side. So Jan played knight e4, and now h4, c5, this was their game. And here what interested me is this idea, again with knight c3, and then the recaptured d takes c3. I think that Lazavik was playing pretty fast until here, so it might have been his preparation. And the idea overall is pretty nice, that now white has this d2 square for the queen, and then can castle queenside. Jan played knight c6, which is the most logical move, and here Lazavik went for c4, which also leads to interesting play. But what I liked even more was just to go queen d2 and then follow up with long castle, and only then to go c4, because Lazavik went c4 first, and now Jan had the chance to push d4, which he didn't do. Probably what he missed, or what I needed to have some time to figure out here, was that this pin is just winning for black, because bishop c5, c3, and e5 is picking up the piece for black. So d4 would have been good here, and therefore I like queen d2 even more than c4. But yeah, overall, just a mini idea here. It's good if you've seen it. If you have it with the black side, I'm not sure actually what I would do. Here there was also this move queen a5, which I checked, which does set up like a small trap, because here queen d2 is less good because of c4, when the bishop on b2 will be locked out. Here knight d2 I think was the best, and then again to push for some c4 ideas, just breaking the pin here. So maybe I would try this, but overall, it probably won't happen that often, this variation, but especially in blitz, if you have it with the white pieces, I would definitely try and give it a shot. All right, guys, so that was it for today. I was just editing the video now, and I just wanted to say I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I know that this is kind of a new format, which I also haven't seen anywhere else on YouTube so far. So I'm kind of having some adventures here when it comes to content, but I'm always open to feedback. So if you have any suggestions on what is good or what could be better, definitely let me know in the comment section down below. Otherwise, I wish you Merry Christmas if you see this, and if I guess this will be my last video before Christmas. And yeah, have a nice holiday, all of you guys, and most likely I will see you in New York City, where I will play the World Rapid and Blitz Championship. So thank you for watching, guys, and see you soon.